So, picture this. An unstoppable existential threat is bearing down on Rome, and it crashes head-on into an immovable military genius. The result? Absolutely unimaginable tragedy. In this explainer, we're diving deep into the Cimbrian War. Now, this wasn't just some minor border skirmish, right? We are talking about a massive migration of entire peoples, the Cimbri and the Teutones, literally crashing into the Roman Republic. It's a story of unmatched tactical brilliance for sure, but it comes with a horrific human cost that would scar the Roman psyche for centuries.
To really understand the sheer terror gripping the Republic at this time, we have to look at the pure arrogance of these migrating tribes. Imagine this. Teuton warriors are marching past a Roman camp for 6 straight days. And they aren't just walking by, they're actively taunting the legionaries, shouting things like, "Do you have any messages for your wives? After all, we'll soon be with them." It is chilling. But here's the thing, they actually had the victories to back up that confidence. For over a decade, traditional Roman armies, led by aristocratic generals, had just been utterly crushed by these massive, mobile tribal coalitions.
These groups carved a path of absolute destruction right through Europe. They originated way up in Jutland, which is modern-day Denmark, and moved steadily south, likely driven by widespread drought and climate shifts. But remember, they weren't just an army. They were an entire migrating society of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children. This whole movement culminated in 105 BC at the Battle of Arezzo. Thanks to some serious infighting between Roman commanders, 80,000 Romans were slaughtered. To put that into perspective, that was Rome's worst defeat since Hannibal at Cannae. The path to Italy was suddenly wide open.
Facing total annihilation, Rome was literally panicking, but in that panic, they turned to Gaius Marius. Marius was a new man, meaning he came from outside the traditional aristocracy, and he radically transformed the Roman legions. He completely abolished the old property requirements, which allowed the landless poor to enlist for pay and the promise of land. He standardized their weapons, brought in brutal, systematic training, and even made the soldiers carry their own heavy gear, which actually earned them the nickname Marian mules. All this strict discipline and intense physical conditioning, it was specifically designed so the Romans would never break rank, even when facing terrifying, screaming barbarian charges. He basically turned seasonal citizen militias into highly disciplined professional killing machines.
So, what we're looking at here is a stark, fascinating historical contrast. On one side, you have Marius's meticulously trained forces, disciplined, uniform, fighting for career advancement and retirement land. And on the other side, the raw, desperate power of a massive migrating horde fighting for a new homeland, bringing their families, their livestock, and their entire material culture with them in wagons. It is the ultimate clash of strict military order versus sheer, overwhelming momentum.
Let's fast forward a bit to 102 BC to see Marius's brilliant trap at Aquae Sextiae. The Teutones and Ambrones were marching toward Italy, and Marius finally found his perfect moment. He used psychological warfare at its finest. He purposely kept his men locked inside their fortified camp for days, forcing them to endure the barbarian taunts. This just built up their rage and forged iron discipline. When he finally did deploy them, he flat out refused to fight on the barbarians' terms. Instead, he secured the high ground, positioning his men on a steep hill. He knew the enemy would charge uphill and exhaust themselves before they even swung a sword. And while he's baiting this massive frontal assault, he secretly hid a force of 3,000 Romans under Claudius Marcellus out of sight in the nearby woods.
And you know what? The strategy worked flawlessly. Trapped between the downhill push of the super-conditioned legionaries and Marcellus's hidden ambush erupting right into their rear, the Teutons literally had nowhere to run. Their ranks shattered, the battle turned into a massive rout, resulting in the slaughter of an estimated 90,000 Teutons. Their king, Teutobod, was taken in chains. The Teutons were effectively wiped off the map as a tribal entity in a single day.
But as the dust of this monumental victory settled, the narrative takes a really sharp, sobering turn into the grim reality of ancient warfare. Winning the battle was just part one. Dealing with the surviving population was part two. Under the conditions of surrender, the victorious Romans issued a devastating demand. 300 married Teuton women were to be handed over to serve as concubines and slaves.
Faced with a life of forced servitude and violation, historical accounts tell us these desperate women begged for a religious alternative. They pleaded with the Roman consul, asking to be set apart as priestesses to minister in the temples of Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, and Venus, the goddess of love and femininity. It was this heartbreaking, desperate attempt to hold on to some shred of dignity and autonomy. But Marius, he flatly refused their request. He ordered his guards, the lictors, to remove them and sell them into slavery.
We really need to pause here for a second and let the heavy reality of that night sink in. When the women realized there was absolutely no escape from Roman chains, they made an unthinkable choice. The Romans woke up the next morning expecting to divide up their spoils, but instead they walked into a deeply tragic spectacle. All 300 women were found dead in each other's arms. During the night, they had slain their own little children and then strangled one another. They chose an agonizing mass suicide over a life of enslavement.
Now, while the Teutones were destroyed in Gaul, the Cimbri were still looming out there. The very next year, in 101 BC, the Cimbri actually succeeded in breaching the Alpine passes, pouring right into the fertile Po Valley of northern Italy. The other Roman consul at the time, Catullus, had failed to hold the passes and had to retreat. So suddenly, the very heartland of the Republic is completely exposed. This forces Marius to march his victorious legions all the way from Gaul into a final apocalyptic showdown to save Rome.
In July 101 BC, the combined Roman armies with over 50,000 men marched onto the Rhodine Plain at Versailles, and waiting for them was a Cimbrian force of staggering proportions. Some sources estimate it was well over 100,000 warriors. The scale of this clash is just absolute madness. It was literally a sea of humanity stretching as far as the eye could see. The Cimbrian infantry alone formed a massive square covering over 10 square miles, and that was preceded by 15,000 cavalry.
But Marius once again proved his tactical genius. This time, he literally weaponized the environment. He purposely timed the battle for the hottest part of a sweltering July day, knowing full well these northern tribes weren't used to the intense Mediterranean heat. They were forced to fight exhausted and dehydrated. Then he positioned his lines facing west, which meant the Cimbri had to fight with the glaring morning sun reflecting blindingly off the Roman helmets. Plus, the dry summer fields meant the armies kicked up massive, choking dust clouds, which perfectly hid the true, smaller size of the Roman army. And to top it all off, a Roman cavalry charge led by Lucius Cornelius Sulla completely surprised and trapped the Cimbrian horsemen, driving them back into their own infantry and causing total chaos.
Actually, there is this one horrifying detail recorded by historians about the Cimbrian front lines. Because they were so determined to hold their ground against the Roman meat grinder, they had their warriors bound fast to one another with long metal chains passed through their belts. The idea was to ensure no one could break rank and run, but in the chaos of the cavalry retreat and the relentless Roman advance, this chain turned into an absolute death trap. They couldn't maneuver at all, and their very best fighters were just cut to pieces right where they stood.
So the battle quickly dissolved into an absolute massacre. The tightly packed Roman formations, which excelled at close-quarters combat, completely overwhelmed the disorganized barbarians who were also rapidly dropping from heat exhaustion. The panicked Cimbri survivors broke and fled back to their entrenchments, desperately seeking safety behind our drawn-up wagons, which formed this massive makeshift wooden fortress. But as the Romans pursued them right into the camp, they beheld a terrifying and deeply tragic repetition of history.
The historian Plutarch paints this incredibly vivid, terrible picture for us. The Cimbri women did not cower. Dressed all in black against the chaos of the wagon forts, they actually took up arms. But they weren't just fighting the Romans, they became executioners for their own fleeing families. Plutarch writes that they stood at the wagons and slew the fugitives, punishing them for their defeat and preventing their capture, literally striking down their own husbands, brothers, and fathers.
Just like the Teutones before them at Aquae Sextiae, these Cimbrian men and women chose a violent, horrifying end at their own hands, rather than submit to Roman slavery. And the historical accounts of this are intensely gruesome. Women strangled their own children and cast them under wagon wheels. They hanged themselves with ropes made out of their own hair. Men, because there were no trees around, literally tied themselves by the neck to the horns and legs of cattle, goading the animals to drag and trample them to death. This war didn't just end in a defeat, it ended in a mass suicide that practically wiped an entire people out of existence.
Can you imagine the psychological toll that took on Marius's hardened legionaries? They walked into these camps expecting total victory and the spoils of war, only to find a silent, horrifying graveyard. It deeply traumatized the Roman soldiers who witnessed it. In fact, this unfathomable act of defiance birthed a whole new concept in Rome: Furor Teutonics, the Teutonic Fury. The Romans realized they had been fighting a people who didn't fear death at all. They only feared subjugation. This joint martyrdom passed right into Roman legend, mythologizing the Germanic tribes and turning them into the ultimate boogeymen of the North for centuries to come. Rome had won the war, yes, but the fierce, uncompromising pride of their enemy left a chilling, lasting impression. Which brings us to the main takeaway of this explainer.
We really have to ask ourselves, when a civilization is saved by such immense slaughter and witnesses a defeated people choose collective, violent death over submission, what invisible scars do those victors carry home with them? There is no doubt Marius saved Rome, and he built an army that would eventually conquer the known world. But the ghosts of Aquae Sextiae and Vorstgel proved that some victories are so utterly dark, they change the very soul of a nation forever.